founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited, established in New York State, 1981. I would like to welcome our viewers and listeners worldwide and our live Zoom studio audience to this evening's program in our Root and Branch Association Limited English Language Conference and Lecture Series, broadcasting from Jerusalem, Israel, and now celebrating our first quarter century, our first 25 years from 1995 until 2020. Today is Monday, August 24th, 2020 in the Gregorian calendar, and the 5th day of Elul 5780 in the Israelite Hebrew calendar. We are broadcasting from the land of Israel, City of God, Jerusalem, Hill of the Priests, Givat Hanania Abu Tor, overlooking Mount Moriah, where we believe that the third and final Israelite Temple of Jerusalem will soon be under reconstruction, as per the vision of the prophet Ezekiel, chapters 40 and 40 through 48, and stand forever. Our speaker for this evening's program is Rabbi Dr. David Fox, who will speak on Jewish teachings about psychology and therapy. Now I would like to welcome our program chair, Dr. Les Glassman, who will introduce Rabbi Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Lowell. It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce you, Rabbi David Fox. So I'm just going to give a very short introduction because we really are very eager to anticipate your delivery in your lecture. So Rabbi Dr. David Fox is the Director of Interventions and Community Education Project, CHAI, Crisis Intervention, Trauma and Bereavement Department of CHAI Lifeline. And you've been very kind to give us your time this evening and coming all the way from Los Angeles. And we'll continue with questions and comments after your talk. So we really look forward with great anticipation to what you have to say. So without further ado, Rabbi, it really is a tremendous honor and privilege to have you here this evening. And we look forward to what you're going to be letting us know. Thank you. Bell, if you could unmute Rabbi Fox.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the warm welcome and for including me in this important series of talks from a variety of thinkers, leaders, clergy, philosophers, professionals of all sorts. And it's really an honor to be invited all the way from Los Angeles to be part of a teaching process coming from the holy city of Jerusalem. And I will make a disclaimer, and that is that it's close to a half a century where I have been asked to speak on this topic, and I have consistently refused. So many times throughout my career, I've been approached to speak about psychology and Judaism, or psychotherapy and Jewish ethics, and so many different variations on that pairing of domains. And traditionally, I opted not to talk on the mixing of the two topics because so much of the time they were apologetics, namely speakers who wrote about or lectured about psychology and Judaism seem to take the approach of scanning certain concepts that are the product of psychological thought, and then attempting to show that really the Torah had those ideas first. not an approach that was appealing to me. And there's so much change in mental health science. There's so much more brain being put into our understanding of psychology. And there's so much more spirituality, or at least interest in religious experience, that has become part of psychological study, that it's now, thank God, possible to discuss these two domains without having to resort to apologetics. And this particular talk that I've been asked to present is not so much a looking at the contrast or the competition between these two disparate areas, but rather the way I'm going to spin the talk is to look at some of the tenets of Torah belief and Torah practice. And what is it about Torah life, ideally, which is part of mental hygiene? Now, you noticed I didn't say mental health, and mental health is looking at pathology. It's looking generally at lack of mental health, but that concept of a mental health professional. So this colloquially means someone who's working with disturbed people, who's looking at means of diagnosing psychopathology, someone who's looking for ways to treat people who show signs of disorder or illness or maladaptive conduct. And I will say from the onset that, in my opinion, there is no Torah approach to treating psychopathology, just as there's no Torah approach to neurosurgery or to obstetrics or to rheumatology. The Torah is not an instructional manual which is giving us a model to treat people who are ill or who are impaired. So I do continue to shy away from a discussion of Torah principles in treating mental illness or in treating a lack of mental health, because I don't think this is the place that we go to for technique. On the other hand, there is a very different dimension, which I'm terming mental hygiene. And by mental hygiene, think about Purell. That's what we call it in America anyway. That's your hand sanitizers. That's that jelly that you rub on your hands to try disinfecting or to try insulating a person from contracting something that may be germ or bacterial borne. And mental hygiene is the Purell of the mind or of the brain, namely the ways of living, the ways of understanding ourselves, the ways of interacting with other people, the practices that promote wellness or mental hygiene. And this is an area that was not discussed historically in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. Someone once asked Professor Binet in France, who was one of the originators of the concept of assessing intelligence, and he came up with one of the first tests for assessing human intelligence. And someone once asked him for an operational definition of intelligence. And he was stuck for a moment, and then he said, well, intelligence is what my test measures, which is, of course, circular reasoning. And in decades past, in the century and a quarter that psychology has gone out of philosophy and has made its way into science. So if you would ask a theorist in psychology or even a clinician practitioner, well, what is wellness? What is mental hygiene? What's considered normality? So pretty much the best definition we could come up with was, well, it's the absence of pathology. It's when a person doesn't show signs of disturbance. But that's not really an operational definition of mental wellness or mental hygiene. It's not just that it represents whatever's left when you strip away or you treat or you excise or you ablate anything that's causing disturbance. Gradually, we've moved into a newer direction of trying to look at what it is about healthy people, healthy cultures, people across culture, different societies. What is it that they have in common among those who we would consider lacking psychopathology? So for this, we can already begin to look at our Torah for some glimpses and some realizations, maybe some premises and assumptions about what would be wholesome life by a Torah framework that might inform us about some of the practices and some of the mindsets and some of the beliefs and thought processes that would comprise this emerging domain of wellness or health or mental health, so that it's more than just saying, well, if you lack a diagnosis and you don't have pathology, then by default, that makes you a mentally hygienic or stable person. So this is an area that I'm more prepared to talk about. I'll tell you that when psychology first merged into a implemented field called psychotherapy, because psychology includes so many other specializations which don't have to do with treatment. But when that particular facet of psychological science, which was interested in applying principles of psychology for treatment of troubled people to enhance life quality, to improve relationships, to reduce subjective distress. So when we began moving into the field of what we'll call psychotherapy, there was a lot of disdain and ridicule of religion. And this gave religious leaders in all faiths a skepticism and a suspiciousness about this emerging practice of psychotherapy, treating the mind. Because so many of the assumptions that were asserted about the things we have to treat in people, the things we have to get rid of in people, the targets of psychotherapy, so many of them got into people who believed things that couldn't be verified, people who were delusional, people who had skewed perceptions of reality. And so early theorists in psychotherapy, they included in this idea that anything that can't be verified or anything that's purely subjective and not easily anchored in reality or in concrete fact, that's a delusion. That's a sign that a person's deranged, or a sign that a person's primitive, or a sign that a person has maladaptive mental process. So that included religion. And early theorists in this field had great rejection for the idea that a person could be mentally healthy and still engage in religious practice and still entertain spiritual thought So it's because of that bias, it's because of that assumption that spirituality and religious behavior were indicative of disturbance or of immaturity or of not being tied to reality, that so many religious leaders had this skepticism, would not encourage their followers, their congregants, their disciples to pursue the study of psychology or to engage in psychological treatment. And there was a basis in their suspiciousness because there really was a vociferous antagonism to the idea that a person who has beliefs that can't be verified, or a person who entertains ideas of the supernatural or of the paranormal, could be a well person, could be a stable person. Now, when I entered the field many, many decades ago, there was a very evident resistance to accepting religiously observant persons to study graduate level psychology. We didn't fit, and many of us felt unwelcome. Some of us, not myself, but some of us were really barred from entering programs because if you wrote in your application into graduate school that you were an Orthodox Jew or you were an observant Catholic or some other faith. So this was considered a probable indication of your instability or something not healthy about you. But those of us who went into the field, who gradually began wondering, what about spiritual experience? Can we talk about it? Are there similar experiences among people who are devout? When people speak about intuitiveness or epiphany, when people speak about higher consciousness or sensitivity to something sacred in Jerusalem, feeling different when I'm at the Kotel, when people would speak about that subjective experience, can we study this? Can we look into it? Is there anything in psychological science that it can help us explain what this represents in us? Is it happening in the brain? Or is it happening in the mind, if we can dichotomize those two? Which means, are these experiences generated by neurological change in the brain? Or are these entirely based on a person's subjective need to see things or to believe things, to want things to be true? Are they mental processes and not brain processes? So this is what we were running into many, many years ago. And it was interesting that getting involved in the field, I did join the American Psychological Association. And we had a division in the many scores of different specialization divisions that one could join as part of the APA. There was a division, it was called PIRI, P-I-R-I, which stood for Psychologists Interested in Religious Issues. Okay. Now, for a person who has strong theological drive or who has a strong spiritual part to his or to her nature, there's a little bit of a turnoff that we're going to lump this into something that sounds very sterile and unwelcoming, psychologists interested in religious issues, especially because issues is one of those euphemisms for problems. It's quite heartening to note that in the last few years, the last number of years, that this division in the APA has changed its name to Psychology of Religion. So now there is, possibly through the advent of neurological findings about spiritual experience, partially because of the ubiquitousness of people who talk about their religious practices and its influence on mental hygiene and stability, and partially also because there are so many more religiously observant practitioners who are in the field and who don't feel a conflict between practice of religion and practice of psychotherapy. Possibly because of all of these contributing factors, there has been a change in the field's appreciation for spiritual and for religious practice and experience. There's more of an enthusiasm to research this and to understand this. So we're now at a very, very different place, even in professional psychology, with regard to our attitude about subjective experience. So really that's the greatest rationale I have for changing my decision not to talk about these topics, and to feel that I can now speak about the mental hygiene of Torah life, of religious life, and what are some of the things that living a Torah life can do that can influence our mental hygiene. So let's look, what are healthy people? What are some of the characteristics people across culture have in common when we would identify them as people not only void of disturbance or who have manageable disturbance? I often joke that when I'm asked to do couples counseling, that really what I'm looking for is, can I help the husband and wife develop compatible pathologies? Meaning, can I help them find a way to coexist by accepting each other's shortcomings and conflicts in a way that they can live compatibly together? But that's something I just say humorously, not to make fun of people. But what are some of the things that people share in common when we would say, regardless of where they live and their ethnicity, that these would be indications that they've got manageable pathology, which means that their life is not dominated, their mental life is not dominated, for example, by unstable mood, by peculiar thinking, by ideas which have no basis in fact, that their life is not characterized by tension and friction and disagreement with others, and that their behavior is not characterized by self-harm or harming others. So what are some of the things that people share in common who have what we're going to call wellness or positive psychology or mental hygiene? And what can we see in Torah thought that might promote these types of mental functions? So something that we see that we will characterize as a sign of wellness is that a person has a balance of intrapsychic forces, which means that let's go back to an old model that mental functioning, it involves the things I do to pursue pleasure, the things I do to take control, the things that I do because they're right and I have a conscience, and the things that I avoid doing because they're wrong, they're just not acceptable because I have a conscience. The things I do because they promote my sense of self, they round out or they extend my sense of identity. I'm clear in understanding what makes me different than you and everybody else. So let's say that these are the hypothetical psychic forces, the things that drive me, the things that push me to seek or to act in certain ways, the things that I do because they're life-preserving or life-extending, the things that I avoid doing because they'd be harmful for others, the things that I do because of a sense of what's right and what's wrong. So all of these We're going to call them intrapsychic forces, parts of myself. So people who have a balance of those, people who have structure, which means that none of those particular aspects of behavior dominates their life. So we can find pathology in people for whom any one of those becomes the real pulsating force that defines how they are in this world. So obviously the person whose pursuit of pleasure is paramount. So we're going to have words, pathological words for that person. We're going to call them narcissistic. We're going to call them self-centered. We're going to call them greedy. A person whose primary modus operandi, or I should say modus vivendi, the way they live daily, is characterized by the need to take charge and to be in control of others. We're going to call them aggressive. We might call them sociopathic. A person who's burdened by excessive guilt because everything seems like a problem of doing the wrong thing. Or a person who is excessively driven to do good deeds and doesn't feel right if he or she doesn't succeed at that. So we're going to say that their conscience is taxing them. We're going to say that that part of their mental energy is really strangling them. So we can look at so many of these hypothetical mental forces, intrapsychic forces, as not being healthy if any one of them are in an extreme. But we can then say that if a person who has a balance, who structures these, which means they do take care of themselves, and they can promote the self, and they can set limits with others when necessary, but they can also be supportive and helpful to other people. And they do have a sense of gauging what feels appropriate and what does not. So when we look at people who have that balance of intrapsychic forces, so we're more likely to say that this person lives a healthy life. They're stable, they're wholesome, they're not skewed or imbalanced in any particular way. And I will say that so much of Torah practice is promoting that structure or that balance of forces, because we're not into asceticism. We don't in any way value a person who consistently deprives themselves of basic needs for survival. And we very much promote what we're going to call altruism, although that's a delicate word, but we're very much into that pro-social quality of interpersonal relationships. So many of the emphasis in the Torah's commandments involve compassion, involve helpfulness, which includes helping people we don't like and not causing harm to people, whether we like them or not. So we have the self-care focus in so much of Jewish thought, that veering away from practices which are self-harming or self-depriving. And in turn, we do have so many of our mitzvahs, so many of our commandments, which do focus on taking care of the other. And even if we think about it, the concept of doing good, it's not utilitarian. It's not doing good just so that I can be a nice person who's recognized as a good person. But so many of the ways that the mitzvos are introduced, that they're packaged by the Torah, they have that intrasubjective nuance to them, which means that even in the commandments that I'm following, which look like they're bein adam lechavero, which means they're interpersonal, the consequence of this behavior will be to help someone else. The way it's framed by the Torah is so that you become a better person. I like to think, for example, of a pasuk in the Torah, where the Torah says, don't curse a deaf person. Now, it's a perplexing verse because I might shrug my shoulders and say, well, if you can't hear me, no one's being hurt. If that deaf person can't hear me curse him, can't hear me insult him, so then where is the diminution of my bein adam l'chaver? I'm not harming him. He's not conscious that I have vile or unpleasant things to say to him. So why would the Torah package this prohibition on cursing anybody as don't curse the deaf person? We would think that the Torah could have said it a lot more simply, don't curse people. And by the way, that scope, the scope of that mitzvah, the scope of that commandment does incorporate all people. It's not only the deaf person I can't curse. I can't curse anybody. It's wrong. Torah forbids it. So then why do we limit it in the package? Why is that particular commandment couched as don't curse the deaf person? So there we see, if we begin peering into our Talmudic sources, that's a fine illustration of the intersubjective. Namely, that the Torah is telling me it doesn't make a difference if anyone hears you when you curse them. It's not good for you to look at other people that way. They can be entirely oblivious to the fact you've just said some unpleasant things to them. They can't hear you. But look at the effect it has on me. Look at what it says about me. Look at how it contaminates my perception of other people. So this is an example that we have the Torah pushing me for avoiding extreme behavior, not pushing us for self-deprivation, prompting us to be caring about society in general and to needy individuals, and even people who are not needy abjectly, but need something from us and we can help them. So the Torah is commanding us, this becomes our truth, this becomes our charge. And even going into that sort of intrapsychic, what am I getting out of pursuing and acting on these commandments? Well, I'm shaping my character. I'm sanitizing, I'm using this neurological Purell and cleaning up some of that negativity and that cynicism about other people. So I think we do see that balance of psychic forces in so many of the commandments that were given. Let's talk about spirituality. So many things that we can stuff into that loose word. It's still not well-defined spirituality. What we do know, it's not the same as religious, because religious has much more to do with visible behavior, ritualistic practice, but spiritual or spirituality, that is prompting us to look beyond what we're doing and what's going on inside of us when we're doing it, what's changing inside of me through this observance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that psychological science has relatively new interest in this. To paraphrase something that was said long ago about psychology, that psychology has a long history, but a very short bibliography. Hans Ebbinghaus said that a long time ago. But the psychology of spirituality has a much shorter bibliography. There's so much less work, but on the other hand, we have begun peering into that part of ourselves, that subjective experience. Someone once called it the numinous, that sense that's hard to define, that you're in touch with something that you can't define. So this part of mental wellness, mental hygiene, namely that one of the things that I'm able to do is more transcendent, which means that I'm not limiting my worldview and I'm not limiting my mental preoccupation to material things alone. of how much money I'm going to make and what I'm going to do for a career and who I'm going to marry and how I'm going to get back at the people who hurt me. But there's a whole other realm of brain activity that is, we'll call it transcending, or let's say that it's moving beyond a lot of these material, mundane things that are the demands about how I behave. But there is an area of self-awareness, which we're going to call spirituality. What goes into it? Okay. So our spiritual life, it involves things which are more or less psychological. For example, hope or hopefulness. So hopefulness doesn't have to involve anything religious. It doesn't have to involve any ritual practice, but just the ability to hope. So hope, we're calling that psychospiritual, because what hope means that I'm projecting my thoughts cognitively. I'm projecting my thoughts into a future time with a belief that something's going to be better. And having that thought actually activates something non-cognitive in me, which means it activates some type of affective or emotional change in the way I feel. So we're going to call hopefulness a spiritual resource. In Kabbalistic thought, it's called a koach hanefesh. It's one of the energies of the spirit. But hope is an example of something psychological. We speak about it all the time. Well, I hope you get better, or I hope you make it, or I hope things work out. But for me, as a subjective experience in my own mind, when I say I'm hopeful, so really what I'm doing is I'm letting my thoughts look ahead of the present. And I'm believing that something will work out. And just the fact that I hope for a positive outcome, that does lift the spirit. It brings on a more positive or optimistic emotional sense in me. So that sort of coalescence of thought, of emotion, and transcending the moment or the present. So those are examples of what we call spiritual energies. So hope is something. Faith, let's take that as a psychological construct, but recognize that it's also a spiritual construct, because when I have faith, that's different than confidence. I can have confidence in myself and I can have faith in myself. I have confidence in you, I can have faith in you. But confidence means that I'm very self-aware, objectively what I can do, what my capabilities are. I'm very, very conscious that you have talents, you have skills, okay? So that's very, very much rooted in the here and the now. That's very much rooted in the real and in the material. But when I say I have faith, so faith means when I'm not sure and I'm not convinced and I don't know enough about you or I don't know enough about myself, but I have what we're going to call this higher sense, which we're going to now call faith rather than confidence, that there's a system, there's a paradigm in the cosmos. As an observant Jew, I'm going to put God at the top of that paradigm as the master of creating and crafting and implementing that paradigm. But faith means that I've got an element of doubt, but I've got a resource, I've got a koach hanefesh to address that doubt by feeling that there's going to be an outcome, and what it will be what's best. There's going to be an outcome, and when that outcome comes, I'll find that I have the resilience and I have the kochos hanefesh to deal with it. So faith is another example of what we're going to call a more transcendent or a more psycho-spiritual process inside of the mind. Not all of us do well with hopefulness, but there are things that can be cultivated. Not all of us feel faith, but that too can be cultivated. And people who cope with adversity, people who have to deal with stress, people who have to deal with some, but not all forms of trauma, some forms of trauma, they cope better when they draw on faith and when they draw on hopefulness. In fact, in treating trauma, which is something that I do as a traumatologist, so much of the time, the protocol for working with a person whose life has been devastated, whose faith has been shaken, whose hope has been dashed, so much of the therapy is going to be helping them find ways to look at that disillusionment and to recognize the mental wellness of being able to re-access those feelings. Now, their faith may still have been shaken. Their hope may still have been dashed, but helping the person recognize that when those resources are part of your mental life, you do feel better. Those are still kochot, those are still resources inside of you, whether the particular faith you used to have or the feeling of hopefulness that you once have, whether or not they're going to work for you in the same ways. But the feeling state, that sort of, as I said, the coalescence of thinking and feeling and transcendence that are part of your resources, being able to access them. So these are essentials for being able to get past some of the trauma, or at least to find ways to adapt post-traumatically. So there again, we have an example of something that we'll call spiritual, and very, very much our faith system as Torah-based observant Jews, it's beckoning to us, not just to say we have faith, which is blind, and it's a little bit naive, but instead the Torah and so many of our holy sources are saying, cultivate that, exercise it, build on it, find out what it is, seek it out. So there is this prompting in Torah life, not to say, I blindly have faith. Because as I said, that's a little bit premature and naive a lot of times. Even Maimonides writes that that works for uneducated people and for ignorant people. Sometimes they'll get by on that sense of, well, I just believe and that's the way it is. But a discerning person or a person who has been scarred by adversity. So the Torah is prompting us, experiment with faith, test God out, exercise that koach hanefesh. So here again, we have the sense that the Torah is prompting us. You know, the Talmud says that on the days of judgment, when each of us has to face God after this life, after this existence, so there are a series of questions that are going to be put forth to us. And one of those, interestingly enough, is Tzipisa Yeshua, that did you form an active, hopeful attitude that things are going to get better? And of course, it's puzzling that if that's so important, how come it's not one of the 613 commandments? Nowhere in the Torah are we told, thou shalt have this hopeful attitude about things getting better. And yet I'm going to be taken to task, and God, so to speak, is going to ask me. I'm going to be asked when I'm accounting for what did I do with my life. I'm going to be asked, well, is that something that you developed? Is that something that you worked on? Is that something that you valued and you constructed inside of yourself, that ability to look beyond the moment and recognize that there's a paradigm and things work out, and to feel it now, even though it's not yet happening. So this, I think we might infer that even though this is not an explicit commandment, but it's still axiomatic to being a stable person. Part, as we said, of being a mentally hygienic, stable person is that you access that type of internal practice, that you're open to this concept that I can put my mind into zones of thought and feeling that fulfill me and that bring me to a certain level of tranquility and acceptance that I'm safe, I'm secured, I'm cared about, and there's a plan to all this. So again, that's another example of a psychotherapeutic process helping people develop something that we don't have to look too deeply or apologetically to recognize that this too is part of the Torah's prescription for us. Now, I see, although we did get a late start, I see that in keeping to the time frame, which is so important, that we don't have an awful lot of time. I could speak a few more moments, or I can stop now if there are questions. I see someone has raised something on my chat, and oh, it's just a pun, but it's a good pun. You don't call it Purell here in Israel. Okay, but I think we know what we're talking about. But I'll turn to Lowell and to Les and to Larry. Do you think,
I think
are
you
there
could continue. I think we all would be wonderful if you could continue, Rob.
Okay, if you can stand it and if you can handle it.
Wonderful.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit further. I'll introduce another construct, which is a moral construct, but I believe the way that it plays out in the mind is more spiritual. And that's the construct of integrity. You know, the Rambam, Maimonides, when he writes about great thinkers who preceded him, and he speaks about Aristotelian thought, and he speaks with awe about the accomplishments of Aristotle. And he says that his mind was so well developed that he was just like a notch below whatever it takes to achieve prophecy. Okay. Now, this has astounded a lot of other theologians, that if you take a look at the life, what's attributed to Aristotle, the fact that he was estranged from religion as we practice it, certainly was not from our camp. And what in the world would being very bright have to do with the gift of receiving divine prophecy? Now, I'm not going to attempt to explain what Maimonides' thought was there. I'm very much enamored by the Rambam. Actually, in February of 2019, I went to Fez, which was once the capital of Morocco. And we think of it in the Torah world as the home of the great Rif, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Al-Fassi. Al-Fassi means the man of Fez. But what people don't realize is that Fez was also the town where little Maimonides, little Moshe ben Maimon, lived with his family for about 8 years as they fled from Spain en route to Egypt. So they actually lived in Fez, and they had a synagogue in Fez. And I went to the synagogue in Fez where the Maimonides family prayed. And it's now a non-kosher Chinese restaurant. But it's called Shea Maimonidi. And I walked in with a group of other rabbis. We felt the safety in numbers to go in just to take a look. And throughout this non-kosher Chinese restaurant, there are traditional pictures of Maimonides, and there are Sfarim of the Rambam. So you can actually order your chow mein, but you can't eat because it's not kosher, but you can study the books of the Rambam because they revere him. So I revere him also. That's just an anecdote that has nothing to do with my talk, but I just can't get over it. I went to Chez Maimonides when I was in Fez, which means it's a French title for the restaurant. Okay, so I'm not going to go and explain what the Rambam might have been referring to. It's disputed what angle he was referring to. What I am going to talk about is the concept of integrity. And integrity is, in my mind, one of the kochot hanefesh, because integrity means that not only am I honest with you, but I'm also honest with myself, which means that I don't suppress my conflicts unless I first acknowledge them. And this is also a part of our psycho-spiritual process that we don't practice enough. We know we believe in it. It's a construct. Yes, a Jewish person should have integrity, but we usually translate that means that we have fair business practices, that people can rely on our word. And in fact, this is one of those questions that we're told we will be asked to account for in the world to come. That was our interaction with other people reliable, that people look at us and say they have integrity. That is a very important construct. But I believe psychologically and spiritually, there's more to it. Honesty with myself means that I'm aware of and I acknowledge the things that cause me conflict. If I don't acknowledge my conflict, which means I don't have integrity, if I am not able to be self-aware of the things that trouble me, I'm going to end up doing things which are hypocritical. What the Talmud calls a person who is not tocho kabaro, that what goes on inside of him is not consistent with what he displays to others, or he's not baro katocho, which means the things that he absolutely does believe in and he does value, he's a hypocrite and he doesn't always act on them. He gets away with things people may not spot, but his contradiction gets acted out. So having integrity doesn't mean that I don't have faults or I've gotten past my conflicts, but it goes back to something I said earlier, that if mentally hygienic people have a balance of those intrapsychic energies and forces, that also means that I'm aware that many of the things that go on inside of me, they clash, they compete for my energy, for my consciousness. Many of the things that I wrestle with, it's normal to wrestle with them because, for example, I can't only self-indulge because I gotta care about other people, but I can't care about other people only because I can't deprive myself. So just by definition, having all these different values, all these different systems inside of me, they are bound to create internal conflict in me. To be able to balance them means that I need to be sort of the broker, the comptroller for all of these forces. Now, if I go and I suppress, I push out of consciousness the fact that, I'll use a Jimmy Carter word, not that I'm a fan of it, but that I do lust at times, or I do have impulses at times, or I'm upset with people at times, or I have a temper at times, or I get moody at times. If I try to move past that by suppressing those things, they're going to get acted out. Other people are going to spot those kinks, those quirks, those defects in me. On the other hand, if I get to the point of integrity, which means that I am mindful of what I struggle with, I'm aware that there are parts of me that I'm not as proud of. There are parts of me that conflict with higher values, and I'll define value psychologically as something that I believe in the present, which is going to shape my behavior in the future. That's what a value is. I mean, it's something that's stable. It's something that I believe in it right now to the degree that I know in the future I'm going to continue to act in ways that display this particular value. Okay, so if I am unable to acknowledge in myself that some of my values are inconsistent with other urges or other fantasies or other desires that I have, if I can't acknowledge that the fantasy, the desire, the urge, the impulse, the moodiness, the irritability, the worry, the fact that I'm not always tranquil and calm, if I don't acknowledge that these are also parts of my mixture, I don't have integrity. And the Torah very much is pushing the same things that a psychotherapist is, lahavdil. Meaning when I'm treating a person in psychotherapy, whether it's for depression or for anxiety or for trauma or for any of the other conditions, the mental health problems that bring them into my office, one of the things I'm going to be doing with them is helping them look at the balance of the forces inside of them and getting them to inventory them and to own up to them. Sometimes it can take 2 years before a person can acknowledge that he has a temper, because every time you ask him if he has a temper, he gets mad at you. And he says, I don't have a temper. Okay, but you have people who just, they're not able, for whatever reasons, to own up to the fact that they're deeply guilty or they're deeply ashamed about something. Or they have a lot of rumination that is either self-centered or that's greedy or that's resentful or that's envious. So helping people look at how your internal mix is your mix, that's who you are, and that we do learn to accept and acknowledge so that we can achieve a sense of maintaining a balance. That's what integrity is. Now, so much of Torah thought, as I began to say, is pushing for this, especially as we're in the Elul month. We're just beginning it. It's the month of tshuva. It's the month of looking for ways to feel that closeness to Hashem himself, so to speak. But so much of our avodah, so much of our sacred service all year round, but particularly as we move towards the Yamim Noraim, the days of Va, the high holy days, so much of it is focused on cheshbon hanefesh, on vidoy devorim, of acknowledging and talking through with ourselves who we really are, what we've become, what we've done with ourselves, what we're still wrestling with, what are our secrets, what is our secret fantasy. So much of the we'll call it the religious practice, the religious ritual, is pushing us for that internal sense of integrity, which doesn't mean that you're purely sanitized. It doesn't mean that your alcohol gel, as someone wrote to me, that your alcohol gel is working overtime inside of you, but rather it's the awareness that you need that gel. It's the awareness that you do have conflicts and you do have your struggles, and yet life is not about getting rid of them. Life is looking for ways to accept them and to live in a way that my behavior remains balanced, and people who interact with me say, he's a stable, dependable person. So this would be another example of a Torah tenet, something that's very much emphasized in being an observant, learned Jew, that would be extremely consistent with what we're now recognizing as a therapeutic goal of having integrity, of feeling optimism, of getting past the morbid cynicism that's so easy to think and to feel, especially living in a time of chaos and pandemic and nuclear threats and terrorism. And there's so much opportunity to give up and to develop this sense that life doesn't work out and we're sitting at the outskirts of a civilization that's going to decay and demolish itself. It's so easy to get stuck in that, and yet having the capacity for hopefulness, having the value that lets me look beyond and move towards the things that right now do feel important to me. Having the ability to acknowledge the things that are in conflict inside of me and to own up to them. And they are me and they're parts of me. And I still want to feel that I can take charge and do what's right and to be attuned to my conscience, to my sense of morality. So these, I would say, are areas where a competent, conscientious, and well-trained contemporary psychotherapist would be aiming for developmental, incremental changes in people, which are very, very much tenets of what we believe and what we practice in being religious people. I'm going to grind to a halt. And I know it's late for you in Eretz Yisrael and other places. Here it's not quite noon, which is why you see this radiant glow coming out of my face, which is not my numinosity or my spirituality, but it's the 100-degree sunshine, which gets through the window shades. And that's all it is. I don't always have this glow. I'm looking at my reflection on the screen. But let me stop. There may be one or two questions, and then we can decide to wrap up. Yes.
First of all, I just want to thank you, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. Can I just ask you, Rabbi, are you associated with Jewish Life in South Africa?
You mean the
magazine?
The monthly column called Confluent?
Yeah.
Yes, I write that column.
Oh, so that's where, when I go back to South Africa and I catch up on all the Jewish Life magazines, I recognize your picture and I read your articles, and it's incredible, and it's extremely well received in South Africa, and those magazines go worldwide as well. So
thank you very much. I will confess that that's one of the highlights of my month when I sit down and compose those stories. They're all true. All of those are anecdotes from either my rabbinic life or my clinical practice, in what I call the confluence, where the mind and the soul meet, looking at dilemmas people get themselves into and how they resolve them. So thank you for bringing it up. I write Confluence, and I'm glad someone enjoys it.
Well, I can just mention Rabbi Kivatetz. He wrote that the Jewish Life magazine from South Africa, in his opinion, is the top Jewish magazine. It should be read by as many people as possible, because the content and the authors, you included, it is of such a high level, and it's so inspirational. And your talk was so inspirational. So we're going to open up the floor to questions. Itza, if you would like to start.
Sure.
Yes, thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Fox. I'm starting with something personal. I've tried to figure out what are you going to talk about? And I really hoped what you said in the beginning, the differentiation you made between, seeing everything in the, like deriving, and I understood what you said, and I think it just fits what my first association was, what I would like. Of course, it was Maimonides, but it wasn't just Maimonides. It was my first meeting with Maimonides in my youth in Zurich. And we had a book at home, which was in German. It was from the famous Schocken library, which appeared in Germany until 1938. And one of the books was a selection of Nachum Glatzer from Maimonides' writing. And it stood, and there was a time my parents read it, and I took the book. I don't remember if my father talked about it or if I looked at the book myself. And what really struck me for the first time, like some kind of psychological insight, was what Maimonides wrote to his patient, the Sultan of Cairo, if I'm not mistaken, about Shalvat HaNefesh, about, it's called in German Seelenruhe, the quiet soul or the peaceful soul. How can you, as you said, exercise it? He said, you just have to think, don't get upset. Because usually when you get upset, you're upset about things that happened in the past and you can't change them. Or you're upset about things that are going to happen in the future, but you don't know if they're going to happen the way you imagine they're going to happen. So just quiet down and live in the present, live in the moment. And that is a way to get to this peacefulness of the soul. And the other thing is, when I try to find all kinds of answers, as we all do in the internet or before the internet, I once, thinking about, there is someone in Hod HaSharon who comes from England, I just forgot his name, but who is doing, is on a Buddhist basis, but it's very incorporated into European thinking. And I thought, this living of the moment and the here and now, to live the present, here and now, I know it from Maimonides. And another thing I wanted to ask you in this connection, how much is the treatment or the concept of mindfulness by John Kabat-Zinn, how much is it popular among religious Jews in America or in the world around? Because I thought it wasn't זה לא היה מקרה that the Jew invented this, because it has to do very much with this ובחרת בחיים and everything, all these things that happen. You have to decide in a moment if you want to live and to live on, then you have to look into yourself. And I won't go on, this is just a suggestion and what came up in my mind before when I saw the title of your lecture. Thank you very, very much. Wonderful.
Thank you. And you've certainly touched on some important areas. The mindfulness movement has certainly found a way into the thinking of many psychotherapists today. In one form or another, many therapists do promote mindfulness experience. We may call it by different names.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we'll help people develop mindfulness and being in the present through the use of technology. We'll give them biofeedback machines or similar instrumentation so that they can actually watch how putting their mind into a certain frame will lower their blood pressure and will change their body temperature and their heart rate. So sometimes we'll give them this, what's called biofeedback, so they can see that they're actually capable of bringing changes in the way the body feels by altering the way the mind focuses. We do have to be careful, however, that there are many, many forms of mindfulness meditation. They have been talked about from the time of the Tanoim, possibly there. There are different schools of thought. There are at least 3 different Kabbalistic schools of meditation. There is a meditation that was discussed by Maimonides, as you've said. There was a meditation discussed by Rabbi Sadia Gaon, which is very different. But not all forms of meditation would be called, from my rabbinic view, would be called kosher. And some of them are associated with other ritual practices, which are pagan practices. Some of them posit certain assumptions, let's say, that I have to believe in or assume certain things about the cosmos, about reality, which are very ungodly, which means they keep God out of the equation. Someone once said, I don't want to talk about Buddhism, but someone once said that Buddhism is a religion that doesn't require belief in a God. And I'm not speaking in a critical way. This is just something in the literature. So a Jewish person who's going to look into mindfulness or mindfulness meditation, we want to make sure that those things which we're experimenting with are kosher. I actually gave a workshop with 2 colleagues about 2 years ago. And it was on mindfulness and meditation for Orthodox Jews. So one of them came from the Lubavitch tradition, and it was a very valuable presentation. Another came from a more Kabbalistic, and what I opted just for contrast was I looked at the meditation of the school that we call the Baalei Musar.
I know.
Many would say that the Lithuanian rabbis, who were primarily the movers in that movement, that Musar had nothing to do with meditation. But I demonstrated that that's an oversight, that if we look at what they call Musar Behitpa'alut, the technique that they use for what they call moving the self internally, so that very, very much was a meditative practice. It's just, it's a different modality of meditation. But there's a lot of discussion one could have. It'd be fruitful. Perhaps the organizers of your program can bring in someone who can talk about mindfulness and Jewish thought. You know, there's a tshuva in the Gaonim. So this dates back to about the year 800, where one of the Gaonim, post-Talmudically, of course, he attacks, or I should say, he addresses the passage in the Talmud in the Masechet called Chagiga, which talks about Arba Nichnasu the Pardes, that there were 4 people, 4 great rabbis who entered paradise.
Yeah.
And this particular tshuva from Gaonim says, well, it doesn't mean they went there. It means they projected in their mind what it would be like to be there.
Of course.
In other words, he says that they put themselves into a type of a trance so that they could approximate, each one using his own subjective.
That's an interesting. Oh.
Yeah, and that's very much from the Gaonim from about the year 800. So that's our very early glimpse into the awareness that mindfulness is a spiritual practice. Okay.
Thank you. That's a wonderful explanation. Thank you for this explanation of the Arba Shenichnesu lePardes. It's wonderful. It really adds a very valuable dimension to thinking about that.
Thank you.
Item. Thank you very much.
May I ask a question, Rabbi? Maybe a couple of questions are linked together. What is the role of a Rebbe, like a Hasidic Rebbe, and the fact that the Hasidim believe in the Rebbe in mental hygiene or even resolving certain problems? Also, what is the role of a priest in confession? What is going on there? It's a bit like group therapy where somebody unloads sense of guilt, right? They say something that you wouldn't say otherwise. That might have a curative effect. Also, what is the role of ritual? It's very repetitive. It's always the same prayers, more or less, the same holidays on the calendar. And also, what is the role of semi-trance-like experiences, like Shlomo Carlebach's songs, that people start dancing, and it's sort of like a borderline trance experience. What is the psychological effect of all of this?
Okay. You know, you remind me of a cartoon that was in my office for many years. I'm saying this not sarcastically at all, but it shows a man sitting at the feet of some type of guru at the top of a snow-capped mountain. And the man is wearing his sunglasses and his skis and his ski jacket and so on. And he says to him, "Holy wise man, please tell me 2 things. Number 1, what is the meaning of the universe? And number 2, how do I find my way back to the resort?" So meaning there's only so much we can cover. There were good questions. So the Hasidic experience, you know, I can't I can't reduce something that's very sacred and very mystical into a psychological formula. I can tell you that when Dr. Glassman asked me about my confluence column, one of my stories about 3 years ago, a nurse who was working at one of the hospitals in Israel attended a lecture of mine, a neuroscience lecture of mine in America. And she asked if she could speak with me. She asked your question. She asked, how is it that I have seen children who are delivered with massive medical complications, and the family calls in the Hasidic Rebbe into the room, who gives a blessing to the infant, and then he tells the family to sing a song and to rejoice. And then the family asks the doctors to run the tests again, and this time the results are normal. So this nurse asked me, how does that work? How can that defy science? How can that defy material science? So it's a profound question. It's a difficult question. I can't reduce it into a bite-sized scientific formula. I can tell you that I think Jerry Groupman wrote a book called The Biology of Hope on why do some patients with cancer recover. And he spoke about how there is we'll call it a power, there's an energy, there is something in people who pray together and pray for one another, and people who have hopefulness. He suggested it can bring about cellular change, and he gave his anecdotes. I think that we don't understand it, but I think that's probably at work when people live in a community of faith and spirituality. Again, we can't reduce it into a scientific formula. It would lose its mystique. But I think the confidence people have in a leader, whether it's an Admor, a Rebbe, whether it's a Rosh Hashiva, whether it's someone else, I think that this can change a person's mental frame and can reduce the sense of turmoil in them. And sometimes that's what it takes to feel that now I can pray. I'm not praying out of desperation, but I'm praying for loving kindness and compassion. It's a different modality of praying, and I think prayer has efficacy. I have to believe that. I pray at least 3 times a day, which now leads to your other question. What about the role of ritual? So I agree that a person can be involved in ritual behavior, repetitive behavior, and it may be just compulsive. But if it's accompanied with a mind frame that I believe in this, and I want to use this practice to help me get past my distress so that I can go into that different zone, I think there was a colleague of mine, Paul Binder, he died a number of years ago, but he was using biofeedback to look at kavana. He was trying to measure what are the biological changes when a person reaches that state where the ritual practice is actually accompanied by this psycho-spiritual shift of focus, so that it's a focus without a distraction, and it's not a diffuse focus. He wrote a number of articles before he passed away. So I think when ritual is accompanied by mind frame and spiritual openness, I think for sure we're doing what God wants, but I think intra-subjectively, I think it brings about, we'll call them mental changes, emotional changes in ourself. You know, the halacha is that if I have $1, that's an American form of currency, you've probably heard of it, but if I have $1 to give to charity, and I have to decide, do I give a $1 bill or do I give 100 pennies? So the halacha is I give 100 pennies, because the repetitive giving, it doesn't only condition my behavior, but it brings about an attitudinal change in me, meaning 100 acts of generosity, even though the sum total, 100 pennies is only $1, but to do it once so it's done and it's over. 100 acts of ritual charitable behavior. That's, quoting the Musar movement, that's hitpa'alut. It's bringing about an increased awareness that I'm doing something because I believe in it. So we're going to have, by recurrent ritual behavior, not just compulsiveness, but ideally, if we condition ourselves to doing it and doing it and doing it, it does elevate our awareness of what we're doing. And then that makes our attitude an attitude of generosity rather than only generous behavior. And that brings about a change in me. The recipient, either way, he gets his 100 pennies or his dollar bill, but the giver has now given himself or herself 100 opportunities to build a spirit of generosity. So the giver has gained in a way that's worth more than that dollar is worth to the recipient. Okay.
Rabbi Dr. Fox, what I learned is that when doctors are frightened of a miracle and they see it, they call it a spontaneous remission. When physicists are frightened of a miracle and they see it, they cause it an insufficiently caused event. When mathematicians, this is not a joke, or this is actually what they call it. Mathematicians see something they don't understand, they have another term. And when the 39 Scuds fell in the 1991 war with Iraq, and scientists were baffled because they had statistics from the German bombing of London with V1 and V2 rockets and the Iran-Iraq war with rockets in terms of if they fall in a populated space, what the result should be, that other than one person had a heart attack, nobody was killed. So a mathematics magazine in England was taking a look at this, and they were baffled, and they said, this shows you their intellectual dishonesty. They said, well, it can't be, but it is, so it must be dumb luck. But you're a scientist, you can't say that. Which means, like in Alice in Wonderland, the queen can say 6 impossible things before breakfast, because as we all know, the pretense to science, I have a special major in religion and the philosophy of science to Swarthmore College. Some of the most dogmatic and unscientific people are scientists who don't like when the premises on which their systems are based, and all systems are based on premises, are exposed. Then I'll tell you what my sister told me. She is a professor of pediatric ophthalmology at Columbia University Hospital in New York. And when she was in medical school at Washington University, the doctors assigned her to the children's cancer ward. And one of her jobs, maybe because they didn't want to do it, was to tell parents, your 5-year-old is going to die. And my sister said, every doctor who's honest will tell you they saw what I saw. You go around the wards at night and you expect that little Jimmy, Chaim, is going to be dead tomorrow morning. You go around the wards in the morning and little Jimmy or little Chaim, all the symptoms have disappeared. This is very frightening to people who can't handle limits to their power and their knowledge because they don't know what to do with it.
Well, I often say that there are 3 kinds of people in the world. Those who are good at arithmetic and those who are not.
Right. Tell me, when you spoke about the rabbi and the chassid, is that a placebo-like phenomenon, you think? The mind-body problem? Well, that the mind creates, well, it reshapes itself in because of some placebo effect and maybe acts on the body itself, which again, turn acts on the mind.
Let me close, because then unfortunately I do have to close. Let me tell you something about placebo. We've wanted to understand placebo for many, many years. Why is it that a scientist cannot publish a paper if he or she cannot show that the medicine they used or the technique they used had more than 1/3 effectiveness. Because if it's only up to 1/3 effectiveness, it's called placebo. Because we have this idea that 1/3 of people will report symptom reduction even if you give them inert substances like a sugar pill or water. If you tell them it's a medicine, it'll work. Okay, so that's why we know that you have to be able to show 40% or higher success in order to demonstrate that your research is onto something effective. So that's what science tells us. Now, psychology, of course, is interested in understanding, well, what about the 1/3 of people who do get better? Why is that? So a study was done a number of years ago where they took people who had headache syndromes and they gave them placebos. And they said, take this, your headache will be much better. And sure enough, 1 out of 3 of them reported that they felt significantly better. Okay, so now in the study, they took that 1/3 of people who had improved with placebo, and they gave 50% of them a medication called naloxone. It's a chemical. Now, what is naloxone? It goes under the brand name Nalene. Naloxone, what is it? It's an endorphin antagonist, which means that on the cell, there are receptor sites. And these receptor sites, they're like a lock. And if you put the right chemical key on that receptor site, it will do something in the brain. It'll release a neurochemical, or it'll restrict a neurochemical, but it'll do something. So an antagonist is something that fits on the lock, but stops a key, a curative healing key, from getting onto that receptor site. It blocks a receptor site. So what they did was they gave these improved people naloxone. And naloxone, it sits on the site of the neuron of the brain cell, which releases this chemical we now know a lot about called endorphin. It was originally called enkephalin. Now they call it endorphin in humans. So an endorphin is an analgesic. It's a natural opiate. It's a chemical that your brain cell will develop when it's traumatized or the person's in a lot of physical pain or distress, that will give them that surge of energy to feel that they've got the ability to cope. So for example, if anyone is a jogger, so joggers will speak about runner's high. When you run a certain amount of miles and your body's beginning to tire and your muscles are beginning to ache, suddenly you'll get the surge of euphoric feeling. That means your endorphins kicked in. Your endorphins kicked in because they are there to combat pain. And they're natural opiates, which the human brain generates. They were first discovered by Hughes and Kosterlitz in the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, using pig brains. Then we found that human brains have them also, not only pigs, but humans. Okay, so now, what the researchers with the placebo recoverees who felt better after the placebo, so they gave them naloxone, and every one of them immediately said, my headache is back. They gave them a placebo telling them this will make your headache feel even better. But what that chemical was doing, it was blocking endorphin release, and the headaches came back. So that was one of the first studies to show that placebo is not imaginary. But placebo is, if you believe something is going to make you feel better, it will make you feel better because it's going to bring about a chemical change. The belief brings about a biological or biochemical change in your brain. So you're not thinking you're feeling better, but you're feeling better. The proof being that when you put into that brain something that stops the generation of the painkiller, the natural opiate, so now the pain comes back again. So all I will end with is saying that placebo is not tricking yourself. that when people feel good because of placebo, whether it's because of the Karbachian chants, or whether it's because of the dancing, or whether it's because of the fervor in which they pray or they study Torah or they do mitzvot or whatever it is. But when a person actually feels better because something she or he is doing, so the probability is that if that works for you, meaning if you're from that 1/3 of people who feels better doing this, yes, it's placebo, but placebo doesn't mean it's not happening. Placebo means that you've actually generated a change in the brain at the biochemical level, so you really are feeling better. You're not in pain anymore. You feel elated. It's something to think about.
Why is it only that 1/3 of the people are affected by placebo?
So why is it that 1/3 are affected?
Yes.
Okay, so
Why is it universal?
Why is it universal?
Why is it not universal?
I think it is universal.
They said only 1/3 are affected at the
Oh,
ability.
okay, the finding that about 1 out of 3 get better, that's a universal
Right.
cross-cultural finding. Yeah, but why don't all people get better?
Yeah. Or how percentage?
So there we're left to hypothesis. And the hypothesis would be that people who really believe, they activate change. People who are skeptical and don't really believe they're going to get better, they're less likely to feel better. I apologize, I'm enjoying this. I do have to run, but I would love to hear the recording of what I said so I can hear what I said to make sure that I approve of what I said.
We will send it to
I
you.
hope we'll have thank you. I hope we'll have an opportunity to meet again.
I want to thank you, and I know that we all feel much better after listening to your enlightening talk, and it's been really a wonderful experience, and we are all feeling elated. Not only much better, but elated. But thank you very, very much.
I hope it's not only 1/3 of you.
That's all of us. It's universal.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the gift of speaking to us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And a Shabbat Tov and a Chodesh Tov. And a Shana Tova.
Shalom from Yerushalayim. Ruben, what do you have to say to this? You have to unmute yourself. You don't need it. I don't hear you still. No? Is your mic? Oh, no, you're muted. That's why.
You're muted.
I'll unmute.
Allow unmute?
No, okay, go ahead. Hello, Ruben? So what do you say?
No.
You know, I heard someplace,
He says his
you
mic
were
isn't
there,
working.
that the Yiddish saying, "Denkst du gut, sein gut," something like that, right? That if you think it's good, it will be good. Maybe there's something to it. Sorry?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. You can go.
There you go. But now I can't hear anything.
Oh, now I can hear both of you.
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. It's very good.
I think it's
He's
very
a
good.
top-notch professional. He's no run-of-the-mill.
No. I must tell you, the magazine that he appears in South Africa, it's been for many years. It's called Jewish Life. It is the top publication. The whole community, it comes out once a month. It comes to all the shuls, and it is the most widely read well, most of the Baruch Hashem, most of the community are Orthodox, but it's read by the entire community. And his column, I would say, is one of the most popular, maybe even the most popular out of all the columns in that magazine.
Before we had before we heard this wonderful lecture, I looked at the Musar movement. I have a feeling it has something to do with psychology. At least people practice it. And apparently, the Rabbi Salanter spoke about subconscious, some of the mechanisms in the mind. And so one can also talk about the fact that there are some Jewish sources for understanding how the mind works, how the soul is put together as an architecture, the multiple components. And there must have been, even in the ancient days, some ways of making somebody feel better, which is therapy. So maybe one day it would be useful to hear about it as well.
No, Larry, let me send you some articles I wrote that might be relevant to that discussion.
I'm looking forward to reading it.
Okay, can I say goodbye?
No.
It was wonderful
No,
to
no,
have
no,
you.
no, no, absolutely. It's verboten, like in a Messenger, verboten.
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 So I like to do things that are verboten. Verboten.
Me too. Sometimes, right?
Okay.
Sure. I'm glad that you joined
Okay,
us.
so
You're-
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So
thank
now
you for-
I know how it works, and I hope it will work in 2 days.
We look forward to
Look
hearing
forward to
your
talking about Kafka. One of my favorite authors, Franz Kafka. And you know, we're going to put this up on YouTube, and I'll send out the links, and so will Lowell, so you can pass it around to others who might be interested in this. I think it's a very interesting topic. And important topic.
I think Dr. Fox wanted to see it before you post it.
He said that? No, he just said that he wants to hear what he said. But you think we
And
should
he
do
wants
that?
to make sure that he approves of it.
That's your Rashi, or that's what he said?
He said it.
He
Listen.
said it. He said it. Yes. It's very human because you don't hear yourself when you talk, and afterwards
He definitely said that he wants to make sure he approves of it. I'm saying that I think he wants to hear it before it's posted on YouTube.
I think it's a good idea.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think he said. I think that no. I think he said, but again, it's like Rashomon. Everybody sees a different reality. That he'd like to hear what he said. Also, maybe he can learn something from.
He said, and then he mentioned that he wants to make sure that he approves of it.
Oh, he said that really? Tachlis, he said that.
There's a recording. You can listen to the recording.
That's true. Actually. Well, you think I'm going to believe in a recording? I only believe in reality. You know, the reality is gone already.
You know, can I just say something?
It's Avodah Zarah to believe in a recording. You know.
Larry, can I just say something that you guys, Ruben, you here, and your wife's here, and Ita, you know, Lo, you said something very interesting about the Scud missiles. So I remember distinctly the Lubavitcher Rebbe said it's safe to come back to Eretz Israel. People, or you mustn't leave Eretz Israel, it's going to be safe. And this is before the Scud missiles fell. So, you know, it's something, it was maybe a nevuah, I don't know, but the Rebbe, by coming out strongly saying, don't leave Eretz Israel, it's going to be safe, it really had an effect on a lot of people because they listened to his advice, and Baruch Hashem, it was pretty safe. I mean, it was a miracle.
Wasn't the Gulf War after the Lubavitch Rebbe's stroke?
Well, I know that he said it, and I'll tell you another thing that he said, and I heard this from a Lubavitcher this afternoon, and I know it's true. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said in South Africa it's going to be good for the Yidden. And in '94, when they had the elections, we thought it was going to be a bloodbath. We thought there would be a civil war. Everybody thought there was going to be a civil war. I went actually back to South Africa for the elections, and there was like maybe 1 million of us on the plane going back to South Africa because everybody was leaving, and we thought it was going to be mamish a civil war. And there wasn't. And for the Yidden, there's been so much since '94. When I left in the beginning of '94. Anyone who was from, I knew basically. Today I go back there, the kiruv work and the amount of people that have become from and the shuls, it's booming. It's unbelievable. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe was kind of right because for the Yidden in South Africa, it has been miraculous. Israel Hashem, I'll come here and I'll leave. But he took a bold statement by saying that it's going to be good for the Yidden, and quite a few remained and did very well. But now I think they are thinking of leaving. But at those times, it was nobody knew it was going to happen. So I don't know how, you know, how you listening to it's. I don't know how this fits into the talk, but I think it has an effect because.
Let me see something that fits into the talk.
Really?
Maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I read a book in New York by a surgeon from Yale. I think he's also a psychologist. And he said the following, that if somebody is on the operating table and they're basically anesthetized, they're not awake. And if you say, well, he doesn't have much of a chance, well, let's try it in any case. You say discouraging things, the surgeon, the staff, it will affect him, even though he's not conscious. And if they play a nice music, it will help him recover better. I also heard that if, I used to swim when I was in high school and college, not that well, but my friend Gabor Katz swam much better, which is a consolation to me because I like him. But I heard that if you say that a sportsman, like let's say Mark Spitz, imagines that he's going to get the gold medal for a 100-meter sprint, he has a much better chance of getting the medal, and his time is going to be better. He might save off 1 second or half a second from his time. So there must be something going on that we really don't understand if you're just looking at things from the science point of view.
So when my mic wasn't working, I was trying to get to that point. I asked a question in the chat about the law of attraction. That's the idea that if a person puts their mind to something, then it can become a reality. And I wanted to know, Rabbi Fox's reaction to such a thing, because it's somewhat of a godless philosophy in a way. It's saying that I can create my own reality or my own existence. I don't know.
You can certainly send him an email, okay? But,
Yeah, for sure.
But there's a famous saying that it wasn't Herzl who said that.
No.
If you wish it, it is so, right? No, but there's
if
a
you
way.
wish it, it's no fairy tale. If you want,
that's
if you
Herzl.
want it, not if you wish it. When you
Build
want
it, they will come.
No, that's what I meant to
Okay.
say. I confused myself. Where there's a will, there is
Yes.
a way, okay? That's an American saying. Maybe
Yeah.
English saying.
Or there's another saying, I believe in miracles, but you have to work very hard to make them happen.
Yeah, but that's a cute saying.
אסור
There is a will,
לסמוך
there
על
is a way,
הנס.
there's a lot to it.
כתוב בפירוש, אסור לסמוך על הנס.
Yeah.
אסור. או שזה קורה או שזה לא קורה.
No, you have to make your own.
And only God knows, So.
But one thing I didn't get a response to, or many which I wanted to ask, what is the role of a confession amongst Christians? There must be some therapeutic effect there, no? What do you think, Ruben?
The role of what?
Of confession that the Christians do on Sundays, I guess. When they go in and say, Father, I have sinned. That's what I've seen in movies. Okay?
People say that, in German, the priest or the Catholic or Protestant priest is called someone who takes care of the souls. That's the German word Seelsorger. And a lot of people say that like psychologists become like, and the Rebbe too, I mean, especially the Hasidic Rebbe, something like, as probably people have besides other things, knowledge and everything, there are people who have this this ability to help people and their psychological problems. So I think it's like there is some kind of analogy or whatever, how you call it, between a psychologist and a serious psychologist who really is engaged and who helps people and who has compassion, has understanding, has empathy or whatever it takes, But of course.
No, he also has the tools. He knows about medications also.
When a person is like consumed with a lot of guilt, so just confessing their sin and like verbally telling somebody else about them helps them sort of get the burden of that.
It's like the talking therapy when you come and you talk about something and you get
like group therapy. Group therapy, I assume, is like that, yes. No?
Yeah, like what we're doing right now.
Okay.
Ruben.
I really have to quit. So thank you very much.
Thank you all of you for joining us. It was fun and we learned a lot.
I told you, Larry, in our home they used to say, was kleiner der Eulen, was größer de Simche. The smaller the public, the greater the joy. Sometimes it's right.
Very apropos for
It's the antithesis of the more the merrier.
Yes, that's it.
In New York, they said, I think, small is beautiful or something like that.
Yeah.
So more is less.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Stop the recording.